This warning from the CEO of the nation's largest automaker, General Motors, about the impact of the tariffs on the car industry. Mary Barra told shareholders the tariffs on imported cars and auto parts will cost GM between $4 to $5 billion this year alone, slashing earnings projections, though she did thank the Trump administration for walking back some of the levies on imported parts and raised hope of further changes to come.
General Motors, GM, a pillar of the American automotive industry for over a century, stunned the world when its CEO, Mary Barra, announced a complete halt to vehicle production within the United States. This decision didn't come out of nowhere, but was the culmination of months of economic tension ignited by the inauguration of President Donald Trump and his administration's aggressive new approach to international trade. As soon as the new president was sworn in, sweeping tariffs were levied on America's traditional trade partners under the banner of protecting domestic industries and bringing manufacturing back home. But the world's reaction would push the nation into uncharted territory, with GM caught at the very center of a storm that would reshape the landscape of American manufacturing. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. The automotive sector is woven into the fabric of American identity. For decades, factories in Detroit, Flint, and dozens of towns across the Midwest churned out millions of cars, providing stable, well-paying jobs and sustaining entire communities. GM, the largest American automaker, has long been a symbol of this legacy. But as the global economy became ever more interlinked, car production became a feat of international coordination. Modern vehicles are assembled from thousands of components sourced from all over the world. Engines from Germany, electronics from Japan and South Korea, steel from Canada, upholstery from Mexico, and more. It was this intricate web of supply chains that the Trump administration's tariffs would shake to its core. When President Trump unveiled the new tariffs, the intention was to level the playing field for American manufacturers by making foreign imports more expensive and encouraging companies to source more of their parts and labor domestically. On paper, it sounded like a formula for job creation and economic renewal. Yet, this view underestimated the degree to which American industries, and especially automakers, depend on global inputs to remain competitive. The tariffs didn't just make foreign-made parts more costly, they also prompted America's largest trading partners, Canada, Mexico, the European Union, China, and others, to retaliate with tariffs of their own, creating a feedback loop of rising costs and declining sales. Almost overnight, the cost structure of building a car in America was turned upside down. The price of steel and aluminum, a critical input for every automaker, spiked. Imported parts became more expensive, and the flow of essential materials slowed as customs processes bogged down in the new regulatory regime. Even domestically produced parts grew costlier as suppliers faced higher input costs themselves and passed them along the supply chain. GM, which had invested heavily in streamlining its North American production network, suddenly found itself staring down a massive increase in expenses on every vehicle assembled in the United States. But that wasn't the end of the turmoil. America's trading partners didn't take the tariffs lying down. Each rolled out their own suite of retaliatory measures, targeting a range of American exports. For the auto industry, the consequences were particularly severe. Vehicles manufactured in the U.S. that once found eager buyers in Canada, Europe, China, and beyond were now hit with heavy import duties, making them too expensive to compete with local or other foreign alternatives. Previously, American cars enjoyed pride of place in the global marketplace. Now, dealers abroad were forced to pass along higher prices to their customers, shrinking demand overnight. For GM, the numbers simply stopped adding up. Building cars in the United States for the domestic market became unfeasible as costs soared, but it was the international side that dealt the crushing blow. The company exported hundreds of thousands of vehicles every year, with foreign sales making up a significant portion of its revenue. Suddenly, those markets were closing off, not because of quality or reputation, but due to politics and policy. It was a reality that couldn't be spun or managed away. Within weeks of the tariffs' implementation, GM's internal forecasting teams began flashing warning signals. Profit margins evaporated as the cost to produce each vehicle rose precipitously. Plant managers across the country saw inventory piling up and orders from abroad drying up. Meanwhile, U.S. dealers complained that customers were balking at higher prices passed on from the cost increases. The boardroom became a scene of crisis as executives debated their options. Closing plants, slashing jobs, and abandoning markets was anathema to everything GM stood for. Yet every path forward seemed to point in that direction. CEO Mary Barra, known for her pragmatism and steely resolve, faced an impossible decision. For months, she had lobbied lawmakers and White House officials, warning that the new tariff regime would backfire, not just on automakers, but on American workers and communities at large. The pleas fell on deaf ears. With no relief in sight and mounting losses threatening the company's survival, she made the call that would send shockwaves far beyond Detroit. GM would shutter its U.S. production lines and relocate its manufacturing operations abroad. The announcement landed with the force of an earthquake. Employees at plants from Ohio to Texas found themselves confronting the end of their livelihoods. Local economies that depended on GM jobs faced an uncertain future. The headlines captured the shock. GM moves production abroad amid trade war fallout. It was more than a business story. It was a reckoning with the realities of globalization and the unintended consequences of economic nationalism. Relocating production was no small feat. GM had to scramble to find facilities in countries where the new tariffs did not apply or where the cost of doing business remained viable. Mexico, which still had extensive auto manufacturing capacity and robust supply chains, became an early candidate. But the company also looked to Asia and Eastern Europe, seeking to diversify its risk. The logistics of such a move were staggering, relocating equipment, renegotiating contracts with suppliers, and ensuring compliance with local regulations. Yet, for GM, there was simply no alternative. The implications of this move rippled out across the industry. Other automakers, both American and foreign, faced the same calculus. Ford, Chrysler, Tesla, and even foreign automakers with plants in the U.S. began re-evaluating their own operations. Suppliers, many of which relied almost exclusively on contracts with domestic automakers, were thrown into crisis. From steel mills in Pennsylvania to electronics plants in the Midwest, thousands of businesses faced the prospect of losing their biggest customers. Labor unions, already weakened by decades of globalization and automation, were blindsided. The United Auto Workers, which had fought so hard to preserve American manufacturing, found itself with no leverage. The promise that tariffs would bring jobs back home was shattered, replaced by a new reality where jobs were fleeing faster than ever. Community leaders, state governments, and even federal agencies scrambled to respond. But the sheer speed of the transformation left many paralyzed. On the global stage, the reverberations were just as profound. GM's decision was closely watched by competitors and policymakers worldwide. Some countries welcomed the influx of new investment and jobs, while others worried about a race to the bottom, where companies chased the lowest costs, regardless of broader economic or social consequences. For America's trading partners, the move was vindication of their warnings that protectionism would backfire. For the U.S., it was a bitter pill to swallow, a stark illustration of how interconnected the world economy had become and how vulnerable even the mightiest companies could be to shifts in policy. Financial markets reacted with predictable volatility. GM's stock price plunged on the news, dragging down other automakers and suppliers in its wake. Investors who had bet on a resurgence of American manufacturing suddenly faced steep losses. Analysts pored over the company's balance sheets, questioning how quickly it could recover from the shock of uprooting its operations. Some speculated that GM, now more reliant on foreign production, would struggle to maintain its brand as an icon of American industry. The political fallout was no less intense. Supporters of the tariffs doubled down, insisting that GM's move was a betrayal of American workers and an act of corporate greed. They called for even harsher measures, hoping to force companies to reverse course. Critics, meanwhile, pointed to the exodus as evidence that the tariffs had failed, inflicting pain on the very people they were meant to help. Town hall meetings and cable news debates erupted into bitter arguments about who was to blame and what should be done next. Amid the turmoil, GM pressed ahead with its new global strategy. Moving production abroad allowed the company to sidestep the worst effects of the trade war. In countries where tariffs didn't apply or were much lower, it could produce vehicles at competitive prices and maintain its foothold in key international markets. But the move came at a steep cost, both financial and reputational. Decades of goodwill built up with American workers, dealers, and customers evaporated almost overnight. The once unquestioned loyalty to Buy American now seemed like a relic of a bygone era. As GM's U.S. factories fell silent, the social consequences became ever more visible. Entire communities found themselves grappling with unemployment, declining property values, and dwindling public services. The ripple effect reached schools, hospitals, restaurants, and countless small businesses that depended on the steady paycheck of GM workers. Some towns, already struggling with the decline of manufacturing, now faced an existential crisis. Local leaders pleaded for federal assistance, but the sheer scale of the disruption overwhelmed available resources. Other industries took note. The agricultural sector, already battered by retaliatory tariffs on American farm products, now saw in GM's retreat a warning of what could come next. High-tech manufacturers, electronics makers, and even service industries began reconsidering their own exposure to trade risks. For many companies, the lesson was clear. In an interconnected world, unilateral action could unleash unintended consequences far beyond national borders. The cultural shock was perhaps even greater. For generations, the American car had been more than just a product. It was a symbol of ingenuity, independence, and national pride. Families grew up with memories of summer road trips in Chevy Impalas, or the pride of owning a Cadillac. Now that symbol was being reshaped in real time. Would a GM car made in China or Mexico carry the same meaning? Would American consumers continue to support a company that had left their communities behind? These were questions without easy answers. The broader debate over globalization and economic nationalism took on new urgency. Some argued that the era of America First had backfired spectacularly, undermining the very industries it sought to protect. Others insisted that the pain was temporary, and that new policies would eventually force companies to bring jobs back. But the GM exodus made clear that economic policy in the 21st century could not be untangled from the realities of global supply chains, multinational investment, and shifting consumer demand. For GM itself, the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty. Relocating production meant forging new relationships with foreign governments, suppliers, and workers. It also meant navigating different regulatory environments, labor laws, and consumer preferences. The move offered some relief from the immediate pressure of tariffs, but it also exposed the company to new risks, from political instability in foreign countries to sudden changes in currency values and trade agreements. In the U.S., the collapse of GM's domestic production sent a powerful message to policymakers and business leaders alike. The promise that tariffs would revive American industry now stood in stark contrast to the reality on the ground. Some lawmakers called for a reassessment of the entire approach, warning that other industries might soon follow GM's lead. Others doubled down, vowing to push for even more radical reforms. What made the GM episode so dramatic was the speed and scale of the transformation. In less than a year, a company that had symbolized American manufacturing for generations had all but abandoned its domestic base, not out of preference, but out of necessity. The old models of economic development, protecting domestic industries through tariffs and hoping for a resurgence of manufacturing, were exposed as relics of an earlier era, ill-suited to the complexities of the global economy. For workers, the sense of betrayal was palpable. Many had dedicated their entire lives to GM, rising through the ranks, supporting families, and building communities. The loss of those jobs was not just an economic blow, but a deeply personal one. Stories circulated of workers packing up decades' worth of belongings from lockers, of final shifts conducted in silence, of communities gathering for vigils and rallies in hopes of a last-minute reprieve. The transformation rippled outward. American universities and technical schools, long focused on training workers for manufacturing jobs, now faced a crisis of relevance. Programs in automotive engineering, supply chain management, and industrial design suddenly found themselves out of step with the new reality. Students, parents, and educators began to question what skills would truly be in demand in the years to come. Even as GM adjusted to its new global footprint, the company could not escape the political and social fallout. The debate over tariffs, globalization, and the future of American industry raged on. Some policymakers suggested new approaches, such as targeted subsidies, infrastructure investment, or worker retraining programs. But for many, the damage was already done. The sense of loss, of jobs, of security, of national pride was profound. Amid this backdrop, other automakers reconsidered their own strategies. Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen, and others with major U.S. plants began weighing their options. Some doubled down on automation, hoping to offset rising costs by reducing reliance on human labor. Others looked to move more of their operations abroad, following GM's lead. The result was a cascade of changes, as the entire industry shifted in response to the new economic landscape. GM's decision to shut down all U.S. production and shift operations overseas reverberated through every facet of American life, leaving in its wake a host of new and complex realities for the country to grapple with. The move's direct effects on workers and communities, as well as its deeper economic, geopolitical, and cultural implications, continued to unfold in the months and years that followed. This new phase was less about the initial shock and more about the lived experience and ongoing adjustments that became necessary in the wake of such a monumental shift. One of the most immediate and visible consequences was the transformation of America's industrial heartland. States like Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, long identified with bustling assembly lines and the hum of machinery, entered a new era marked by uncertainty and transition. The shuttered plants, once the economic engines of their regions, became symbols of a vanishing way of life. Some communities attempted to repurpose the vacant facilities for warehousing, logistics, or even tech startups. But these efforts often fell short of replacing the sheer number of jobs or the level of wages that GM had once provided. The psychological toll on displaced workers and their families was profound. Many had built their identities around their roles at GM, taking pride in being part of a lineage of American manufacturing excellence. Now, forced into an unforgiving job market, they confronted the harsh realities of lower-paying service jobs, gig work, or for some, chronic unemployment. The loss of stable benefits and pensions compounded the hardship, making long-term financial security seem ever more elusive. Job retraining programs, rolled out by both state and federal governments in a bid to cushion the blow, met with mixed results. Some former auto workers successfully transitioned into healthcare, information technology, or skilled trades such as plumbing and electrical work. However, others struggled to adapt, especially older workers or those without college degrees. These programs, while well-intentioned, often lacked the capacity or funding to meet the sheer scale of need created by GM's withdrawal from the U.S. market. On a broader scale, the collapse of such a central industry sent shockwaves through the American education system. High schools and vocational programs that had long partnered with GM and other automakers to create pathways into stable careers found themselves at a crossroads. Curricula were hastily revised, emphasizing computer science, renewable energy, and entrepreneurship. Yet the challenge remained: how to prepare students for a future where traditional manufacturing jobs, once a reliable backbone for millions, could no longer be counted on. Urban planners and city officials faced their own set of daunting questions. The abrupt loss of tens of thousands of jobs upended municipal budgets, which had relied on tax revenue from both GM and its employees. Declining populations in affected towns led to school closures, reduced public services, and in some cases, an uptick in crime. Efforts to attract new industries were complicated by the legacy of environmental contamination from decades of auto production, leaving local governments to balance the costs of remediation with the hope of new economic opportunities. Meanwhile, the broader American economy began to adjust to the new reality. The void left by GM's exit was not filled overnight, but gradually new patterns of commerce and industry began to emerge. Some regions experienced a boom in logistics and warehousing, fueled by the growth of e-commerce and changes in consumer behavior. Others found unexpected opportunity in advanced manufacturing, robotics, or the burgeoning field of electric vehicle technology, though these sectors rarely matched the scale or pay of the jobs that had been lost. Consumer habits also shifted in the aftermath. For decades, Americans had gravitated toward domestic brands out of loyalty, habit, or a sense of patriotism. But as the label "Made in America" became less common on GM vehicles, consumers grew more agnostic, basing decisions on price, quality, and innovation rather than origin. Foreign automakers, many of whom had managed to retain or even expand their American operations, captured greater market share, further eroding the dominance once enjoyed by U.S. manufacturers. The move abroad brought a set of new complexities for GM. While relocating manufacturing operations allowed the company to sidestep tariffs and lower production costs, it also exposed GM to a host of new risks. Labor unrest, political instability, and fluctuations in currency became more immediate concerns. Operating in countries with weaker regulatory environments sometimes led to quality control issues, recalls, or public relations crises that threatened the company's global reputation. Supply chain management, already a challenge, grew exponentially more complex. Coordinating the delivery of components from dozens of countries required precision, investment, and continual adjustment. Disruptions caused by natural disasters, geopolitical disputes, or global pandemics could halt production, delay shipments, and erode profits. GM's experience became a case study in the importance of resilience and redundancy in supply chain design. The cultural shift within GM itself was equally dramatic. The company's workforce became far more international, with new management challenges arising from the need to integrate diverse teams across continents. Communication, collaboration, and alignment on corporate values and quality standards required a new level of effort and investment. What had once been a distinctly American company evolved into a truly global entity, its identity shaped as much by its plants in Asia and Eastern Europe as by its Detroit headquarters. At the geopolitical level, GM's move accelerated debates about the future of American influence in the world. The decline of U.S.-based manufacturing weakened the country's bargaining power in international trade negotiations, as trading partners realized that threats of losing access to the American market carried less weight when the products themselves were no longer made in America. In turn, U.S. policymakers struggled to find new levers of power, often defaulting to sanctions or regulatory measures with uneven results. The shockwaves extended even further, touching on issues of national security. The ability to manufacture critical goods within national borders had long been considered essential for defense and emergency preparedness. GM's exodus raised alarm bells in Washington about the country's reliance on foreign sources for everything from vehicles to electronic components to specialty metals. Congressional hearings and reports highlighted the need for new strategies to ensure the security and reliability of supply chains for both civilian and military needs. Beyond economics and policy, the move sparked a broad cultural reckoning. Media coverage, documentary films, and best-selling books explored the personal stories of workers, families, and communities caught up in the transformation. Some narratives emphasized resilience and adaptation, highlighting entrepreneurs and innovators who found new ways to thrive. Others focused on loss, dislocation, and the sense of betrayal felt by those who believed in the promise of American manufacturing. This period also saw a resurgence of labor activism, albeit in new forms. With the traditional power of unions eroded, workers began to organize around issues such as wage theft, working conditions, and the rights of contract and gig workers. New alliances formed across borders, as American and foreign workers recognized their shared interests in a globalized labor market. These movements, while fragmented, represented an emerging force for accountability and equity in an era of multinational business. The GM exodus also forced a rethinking of what it meant to be an American company. In boardrooms, universities, and public debates, questions arose about the responsibilities of corporations to their home countries and communities. Should companies be required to maintain a certain level of domestic production? Should tax incentives or penalties be used to shape corporate behavior? Should government play a more active role in directing industrial policy? The answers remained elusive, but the questions themselves marked a new phase in the relationship between business and society. For some, the loss of GM's U.S. production symbolized a necessary adaptation to the realities of global competition. They argued that economic dynamism required the freedom to move resources to where they could be used most efficiently. For others, it represented the abandonment of a social contract that had long underpinned the American middle class. The debate over these competing visions became a central theme in politics, culture, and public life. As the dust settled, new patterns began to emerge. Some communities succeeded in attracting investment from other industries, renewable energy, biotechnology, or advanced materials, transforming themselves into unexpected hubs of innovation. Others pivoted to tourism, arts, or education, leveraging their history and cultural assets to attract visitors and new residents. The transition was never easy or uniform, but it demonstrated the capacity of American communities to adapt, even in the face of daunting odds. The experience of the suppliers was just as tumultuous as that of GM and its direct employees. Many parts manufacturers, having invested heavily in proximity to GM plants and tailored their output to GM specifications, suddenly found themselves with empty order books. Some managed to pivot quickly, finding new clients in foreign automakers or diversifying into entirely new product lines. Others, especially smaller or highly specialized firms, were not so fortunate and succumbed to bankruptcy or acquisition. The ripples extended to the financial sector, where banks and investors recalibrated their strategies. The risks associated with lending to or investing in traditional manufacturing grew clearer, leading to a shift toward technology, healthcare, and finance. The resulting changes in capital flows further accelerated the transformation of the American economy, making it more dependent on knowledge-intensive and service-based industries. As GM's global footprint expanded, it found itself increasingly embroiled in local politics and labor struggles in its new host countries. While some governments welcomed the investment in jobs, others demanded higher wages, stricter environmental standards, or commitments to local sourcing. Strikes, protests, and regulatory disputes became regular features of GM's international operations. The company learned the hard way that relocating production did not mean escaping from the challenges of labor relations or social responsibility. The move abroad also raised uncomfortable questions about environmental sustainability. While some foreign plants boasted state-of-the-art emissions controls and green technologies, others operated in countries with laxer regulations. The carbon footprint of global supply chains, shipping parts and vehicles thousands of miles by sea and air, drew new scrutiny from environmentalists and regulators alike. For GM, balancing cost savings with environmental responsibility became a central tension, shaping everything from procurement decisions to product design. In the United States, the transformation of the automotive landscape was accompanied by a broader societal conversation about values and identity. The notion of American-made shifted from a point of pride to a subject of debate, as consumers weighed the trade-offs between cost, quality, and domestic employment. New certification schemes, branding efforts, and buy local campaigns sprang up, seeking to capture the attention and loyalty of consumers newly conscious of the global origins of their products. The educational system, meanwhile, continued to evolve. Colleges and universities, recognizing the shifting landscape, invested heavily in STEM programs, entrepreneurship, and global studies. Community colleges and technical institutes expanded their offerings in logistics, supply chain management, and green technologies. The emphasis shifted from preparing students for a single lifelong career to equipping them with the adaptability and resilience needed to navigate multiple transitions over the course of their working lives. As the years passed, GM's decision became part of a broader narrative about the future of American industry. The company's fortunes ebbed and flowed with the tides of global commerce, its brand evolving in response to new realities and new markets. In some respects, GM emerged stronger and more agile, having learned to thrive in a world where borders mattered less than networks and where innovation and efficiency were the keys to survival. In other respects, the company remained haunted by its origins, continually negotiating the tension between global ambition and local responsibility. The legacy of GM's move also played out on the international stage. Other countries, having seen the consequences of the American experiment with tariffs and protectionism, recalibrated their own policies, seeking to strike a balance between openness and self-sufficiency. The result was a more cautious, fragmented global trading system characterized by regional blocs, shifting alliances, and periodic outbreaks of economic nationalism. The American political landscape, too, bore the imprint of the GM exodus. Debates about trade, jobs, and economic security took on new urgency, shaping electoral contests and legislative battles. New movements emerged advocating for everything from universal basic income to a Green New Deal, reflecting the search for fresh answers to the enduring challenge of economic dislocation. For many Americans, the loss of GM production became a touchstone, a reference point for conversations about the country's past, present, and future. It was invoked by politicians, journalists, and everyday citizens as they debated the choices facing the nation. Some saw it as a cautionary tale about the perils of economic nationalism, others as a rallying cry for renewed investment in American industry and innovation. The story of GM's transition did not have a single ending. For some, it marked the beginning of new opportunities, the chance to build something different or better. For others, it represented a profound loss of stability, identity, and possibility. The complexity of the event lay precisely in its multiplicity of meanings and effects. GM's transformation also influenced how Americans understood their relationship to work, community, and the wider world. As the bonds that once connected individuals to specific companies and industries loosened, people found themselves searching for new sources of meaning and belonging. Some turned to local organizations, religious communities, or civic groups. Others looked outward, embracing the possibilities of a globalized world. The result was a society both more fragmented and more interconnected than before. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on GM shutting U.S. production after Trump's tariffs? What's next? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.